Welcome to an episode of EQUES Trial Lawyers Podcast. We seek to educate and empower our listeners in areas of trial law that affect our daily lives. If you have a question about how a topic that we discuss or any other legal topic affects your life, please either follow the links in the social media or call us at 330-231-1195 for a consultation. Be happy to sit and have a friendly conversation with you and answer your questions. My name is Tom White. I'm EQUES Senior Partner, and I'm joined today by my partner.
I'm Kate Kimball. I'm the Litigation Managing Partner at EQUES Law Group.
Okay, and we are trial lawyers, and before we get into the topic of today, I came across something I'd kind of like to let you folks know about a trial lawyer. Trial lawyers are, of course, common in American culture. Everybody has stories about trial lawyers. There are often movies and TV shows about trial lawyers, but from a realistic viewpoint, I'm a trial lawyer. My clients call me in crisis with the worst nightmares of their lives, and they trust me to guide them through the darkness with wisdom and skill. Trial lawyers do not become great overnight. It takes persistence, relentless work ethic, a willingness to learn from mistakes, a burning passion for my craft, a sense of my authentic self, and the courage and vulnerability to enter the arena time and time again. Those who become great trial lawyers have the opportunity to be great people. Through my work, I grapple with the gritty realities of the human experience, and in the process, I develop character, integrity, leadership, strength, and compassion. And I have the privilege and duty to pass what I've learned on to those who follow me. That's a little bit about what we believe here at EQUES Law Group trial lawyers do, and I'd like to give a tip of the hat to the Richmond, Virginia trial lawyers who have something similar to that at the beginning of their podcast. Kate, why don't you introduce what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. Thanks, Tom. So this is our first episode of what we're going to kind of start as an oil and gas podcast, and we're going to talk about trial issues and all other sorts of issues in Ohio law related to oil and gas. So many of our clients in southeastern Ohio, and we're seeing it kind of expand even a little further west of where we've been seeing it, for the last 15 years or so have been involved in a lot of development and horizontal oil and gas production from those horizontal deep wells. And so we're going to talk about all sorts of things that I know Tom and I think are interesting and exciting. And hopefully people who listen to this also will think that they're interesting and exciting. So in this oil and gas issue area, a lot of our clients have really benefited from that and had a lot of great wealth. We also have some stories about some heartache that clients have experienced related to oil and gas issues. So we're going to talk about some of those. And through all of that, our trial experience has really grown. And we are happy to share our knowledge and experience about those things through this podcast.
So Kate, as far as being an oil and gas trial lawyer, can just anybody do that kind of work?
It's kind of an odd thing for us to say no when we do it, right? Like it feels like it's coming from an odd place for me, but it really is a little specific area of the law. And unless you are in it and know about it, it can be really difficult for just a general practice attorney to pick it up and take off, I think. I've heard you describe it to clients as a heart surgeon, specifically as a heart surgeon. They're not going to operate on a foot or something that's totally not their area. And so I think we kind of equate oil and gas law to that kind of scenario too. It's kind of a special issue.
Yes, and we know that because you and I keep running into the same people all the time. The people who represent the oil and gas producers, and then the people on our side who are landowners advocates. There are very few folks who, in this very complicated area of the law, kind of know what we're talking about, and therefore we keep bumping into the same people, either on the same side or opposite of us. Folks, a question we usually get is, what is EQUES? How do you pronounce it? And what does it mean? this law firm was started when I retired from being a judge in 2010. And the only other person was my son, Chris, who is now the managing executive partner or whatever he is at this point in time. And we decided upon my retiring from being a judge that we were just going to be a small firm. Now, as we grew, we started as the white law office, but as we grew, we found that in other areas other than our home area, white law office doesn't mean what it means where we're from. Indeed, from time to time, we would get inquiries as to whether we were a racist law firm or not. And we go, no, it's just our last name. So what we decided to do was form EQUES Law Group. EQUES is Latin for knight, K-N-I-G-H-T, which happens to be your maiden name, right?
It is. It's very fitting. I told Chrissy we have to keep the knight emblem forever because it's fitting for me.
And the knight emblem comes from a knight chess piece because we enjoy the chess aspect of preparing for trial and going to trial. So that's who we are, and you pronounce it. We pronounce it EQUES, although I've heard it pronounced about 5 or 6 different ways. Kate, what is our history in southeastern Ohio?
Sure. Actually earlier today, which I'm not sure if it'll be on before or after this podcast, but Chris and I talked about in a separate episode of Basic Business Advice, rural practice in Ohio for attorneys. And so we talked a little bit about white law office, now EQUES in southeastern Ohio. And after, like you just mentioned, you and Chris started in Holmes County. Then I think you moved to Woodsfield next, right? And so in Monroe County, which is kind of the good, like perfect example of southeastern Ohio counties. And so with an office in Woodsfield, and then you moved up to Caddis, which is where I am from, and found you guys. And I'm sure we'll talk some about that too. Between those offices, though, I think EQUES's history in southeastern Ohio was really related to property issues and oil and gas issues, right, Tom?
Correct, because we just happened to take over. There was a gentleman, James Peters, who was becoming probate juvenile judge. He had an extensive real estate practice, and he was looking for somebody to service his clients, because as a judge, you can't represent people anymore. And we were fortunate to be able to slide into that, and then saw an opportunity in Caddis, and it just so happens that the 3 counties that are right there, 3 or 4 counties that are right along the river, Monroe, Belmont, Jefferson, Harrison, happen to be a lot of development. And yes, oil and gas can be a little bit dry sometimes, but our clients sure do like the number of zeros on the end of the checks that they get when we do our job right.
Sure.
So, and you and I specifically specialize in being trial lawyers, but of course, within the EQUES Law Group, we have a lot of folks that we call transactional lawyers. And I like to think of it as the transactional lawyers are the people who kind of set the train up on the track for you. They're the people who draft the wills, draft the contracts, draft the partnership agreements, draft the limited liability company operating agreements, et cetera, to try to get this train going down the track. But every once in a while, the train may fall off the track or there's a collision, and that's when you have to go to court, and that's when you call in the trial lawyers. So we really value the input of our colleagues. As a matter of fact, the great majority of transactional work that is done by this or any other firm does not result in litigation. If so, the courts would be swamped with it. There are other ways of resolving issues short of litigation, but every once in a while you do have to go to court, and that's what we do. Kate, we call ourselves landowner advocates. What's that mean?
So, landowner advocates is really just especially when we're talking about oil and gas or other mineral issues and things like that, we don't represent like the operator or the producer or those companies that are coming in and doing the leasing. Then instead, we'll represent the other side. So the mineral owners, the surface owners, the individual land owners who are dealing with those companies. And I feel like I'm regularly telling people in consultations or in clients or things like that The first draft of something, right? This is like the transactional side of oil and gas work. So say it's a lease or something like that, is usually written by that operator, and it's for them and it's to their benefit. So I see our role as being that strong position from the landowner side and advocating for their particular needs for their particular property, as specific to them as they need it to be, since that's what the company's doing for the company, right? Like they're working for themselves too, just like the landowner should. And so watching out for those kinds of issues that people might not think of because they haven't done it before or they don't regularly run into it. Those are the kinds of things that we try to advocate for people.
And unfortunately, the worst thing that you can do as a landowner, as we found out early on in what the oil and gas industry calls the play, which is the plan of development, is not to sign the lease on the hood of the pickup truck or at the kitchen table that's presented to you by the company's representative, who is usually a landman, okay? Had many folks who have threatened litigation against landmen. Some have indicated a little bit more direct action, and we always tell them that we are very expensive for criminal defense. So tempers can rise because you're talking about your property. You're talking about your family history with the property, because oftentimes our clients are multi-generational in ownership of the family farm. All of a sudden, there's this windfall that comes about in the past 15 years or so, and we just want to make sure it's done right, that our clients aren't cheated. So, landowner advocates. So, our first couple episodes, we're kind of going to introduce each other and our experience and what we do in oil and gas law, specifically oil and gas litigation. And I think the first episode we're going to cover my background. But before we do that, I want to make sure that we mention, because your last name, your married name, Kimball, okay, this is something that if you call and talk, a lot of people in southeastern Ohio know a Kimball family that's been multi-generationally involved in coal mining and oil and gas and waste management. And let's just start by saying, how are you related to those Kimballs, okay?
Sure. So as far as I am aware, through my husband, whose name it is, he is not related to them. Okay. And if he is, it's very distant. Okay. So I regularly get asked this, and we're sometimes opposed to them because of the areas they work in and we work in.
Right.
And I've had emails with their counsel before, and he'll tell other people within their company, she's not one of them, right? Like I'm not one of those Kimballs. So I think they're also aware. So
you are Catherine M. Knight, not those Kimball's Kimball. Right. Okay.
Yes.
There you go. Okay.
In the office, that's definitely what we use. So
Kate, what do you want to know about my background?
Sure. Well, that would be great, Tom. So I'm going to ask you just a super general question. How and why did you become an attorney?
Well, actually, when I first went to college, I wanted to be a teacher like my father. I wanted to teach environmental education. As I finished my second year in college, I had a conference with my advisor, and my advisor said, I hope that there are teaching jobs in this area once you graduate. And I said, wait a minute, I'm going to college for 4 years, and there aren't any jobs out there? And he says, well, we hope that there will be. Well, that was not something that appealed to me, getting trained for a profession in which I would not be hired. I didn't want to really end up teaching phys ed or something like that, you know. So at that time, at the end of my second year in college, some friends that I had who I grew up with, they lived on the family dairy farm, and their parents, these two boys, their parents had been killed in, I think, a car wreck, both of them at the same time. So the grandparents were still on the farm, so the plan was the grandparents would farm as long as they wanted to or were able, and then it'd turn it over to the grandsons, but they didn't do any kind of planning. And so the grandparents passed, and back then, both the Ohio and the federal estate tax that you have to pay in the events you have property passing between generations, was so high that the boys were not able to get the farm. They had to sell the farm in order to pay the taxes. And I just didn't think that was right. I didn't think that was right. Now, fortunately for those of our listeners, if you own a farm or substantial real estate, Ohio has not had an estate tax since 2012, and the federal government has upped the value of whatever the real estate would have to be before you'd be required to pay any estate tax. So things now are not as bad for transferring property between generations. But I said, how could I help them? And I went over to the library, which Ohio State is kind of the tallest, it might even be taller than the stadium, on the Oval, the tallest building on the Oval. And I was looking at, different colleges in the university had course descriptions, et cetera. And there was a nice purple one there. And I like purple, so I picked it up. It was the law school. And I said, that might be interesting. So finished out my undergrad. I was fortunate enough to be able to get into law school, where I pursued that original concept of estate planning and federal taxation. That was kind of my major emphasis until between my second and third year, I was clerking for an attorney in Millersburg, and there happened to be a murder trial going on. And I found myself taking more and more time as I could cabbage it to go watch as much of the trial as I could. The judge would invite me into his office at the end of the day and would say, what if you were the prosecutor? What would you have done different? What if you were a defense attorney? What would you have done different? And during that process, I got bit by the trial bug. So I had this totally different, very highly technical tax and estate planning training. I decided to get into trial work, and have been there ever since. My wife says I'll die in a courtroom. I just hope I win that one, because I can only pull that trick once.
Sure. Well, that's great. So how did you end up, I don't know if we've said this already, how did you end up in Holmes County? How did you come back?
I grew up here, and my family tends to do things the difficult way. So my wife and I had 2 children while we were in law school, and I say we were in law school because it is a joint effort. So we were looking for a place to raise a family, and I've always enjoyed Holmes County. I'd spent 7 years in Columbus and didn't want to work for a big firm where I'd be chained to my desk, and so I came back and pursuing my desire to go into trial lawyering, became an assistant prosecutor, then prosecuting attorney. Then I was common pleas court judge for 21 years, and then we started what became EQUES.
Sure. So being an assistant prosecutor and then a prosecutor next, how long did you do those things?
From 1981 to 1986, I was an assistant prosecutor. From 86 to 89, I was the prosecuting attorney for the county.
Okay. And then common pleas court judge, which is
Yep.
General, that's a law term, right? General jurisdiction court in Ohio.
Yeah, as they call them the general and domestic relations divisions in most of the small counties. There's another judge that will handle the juvenile court issues and probate court issues. So basically my job was to hear serious crimes called felonies, which is usually something that you can go to prison for. Civil cases for a lot of money, disputes over high amounts of money, and then, of course, divorce court, which is one of the reasons I'm glad I'm retired.
Sure. And so after being common pleas court judge for 21 years, right, you and Chris, which we're just getting into the beginning of this, right, started White Law Office. So why did you decide to do that, besides domestic relations cases?
Well, I'd been burned out for about the past 3 or 4 years as a judge. My family noticed it, and they were counseling me, and there were many reasons that were kind of piling up to the point that it just was not an enjoyable job anymore. One of the things was I became tired of sending young people to prison. It wears on you if you care about people. I heard one too many child sexual abuse trials, which are horrible to sit through. But basically, I had been there, done that, got the T-shirt for everything. I'd been assigned to capital murder cases, and basically I was looking for something new. And when you look for something new, sometimes what you're doing can grow stale. And I think my family realized that. And I still have yet to figure out why my son decided to go to law school. He still has to give me a good explanation for that, but because he saw what a lawyer's family, what it does to that profession does to a lawyer's family. But yeah, he said, hey, why don't you retire and let's practice law together? And here we are.
So tell me more about that, like starting White Law Office, now EQUES. Like, how did that happen, and how did you get into oil and gas law?
Sure. Well, how did it happen? I just used the last couple of months of me being a judge to set up the firm, set up my trust account, do all the things that you have to do when you're founding an office. We lived in a large Victorian mansion, which everybody calls 209 after 209 North Washington in Millersburg, so I had room for an office. I retired one day. The next day I sat looking at the phone wondering if it would ever ring. So that's kind of how it happened. Oil and gas, I've actually been exposed throughout my career. I remember as a young lawyer, prosecutors were part-time back then, and so we also had a private practice. And I remember after the oil and gas boom of the 70s that was generated by the Arab oil embargo, all of a sudden the price per barrel of oil rose to the point that it was economically feasible to start drilling and using wells around here. So you had to do a lot of title work in the recorder's office. And so I became aware of some title issues back then. And of course, it was really nice because at that time, all the offices were in the courthouse. It was pretty much open to the attorneys. Each attorney had a key to the courthouse, and you go into the recorder's office, and if there was a deadline, you could pull an all-nighter in the recorder's office looking up titles. As a judge, there was a development that some folks will remember in the kind of east central Ohio area called the Rose Run formations, which were, if you've seen the photos, or maybe you've actually seen them yourself, the buttes that are out west, these high, kind of cut the cap off mushroom looking things. A Rose Run formation is formed on one of these buttes very, very deep into the ground. But on top, there is a dome of a mineral called dolomite. And under that dome is a lot of oil and gas under very high pressure. And so if you basically drill into it, you're sticking a straw into high pressure. And it was, we had a lot of cases when I was judge that dealt with that phenomenon. It was fascinating because a lot of the technology that we take for granted now was just developing. And as a judge, you're kind of the gatekeeper of what the jury gets to hear. So I had to be educated on what was good science and what was junk science in that regard. So got to hear those kinds of cases. Then as in my latest professional incarnation, in 2011, my son Chris came to me and said, "What do you know about oil and gas law?" And I said, "About as little as anybody else, because it's not really developed in Ohio." The law is developed because of economic drivers. And previously in Ohio, there were oil busts and booms, but the booms never lasted long enough for the legal process to work for trial judges, for Court of Appeals judges, and eventually the Supreme Court. If you have a 5-year oil boom, that's not enough to work it through the process. So Ohio law was very non-developed. And so he said, "Well, I think that there's a potential for representing landowners in southeastern Ohio." And I said, well, that sounds interesting. Let's see what we can do. We were able to partner with landowner advocacy groups like the Ohio Farm Bureau. We would go out and talk to people at schools and community centers to try to educate them. And that's kind of That's kind of how we got into it. And it's been an interesting area of the law because Ohio law is so undeveloped that you could look to Texas law, Oklahoma law, Pennsylvania law. They were much better developed. And then it's like, what is Ohio law going to be like this? So during the past 13 years or so, it's been quite an experience seeing how Ohio law does develop. And I know you see that too in your practice.
Mm-hmm. I do. I feel like that's most days, almost all I talk about is what's going on with oil and gas and Ohio law. So yeah, well, that's good.
And that's difficult for a trial lawyer, isn't it? Because if a client comes to you with a question, do I own my mineral rights underneath my land?
Right.
Okay, which is a very basic question.
Yes.
You have to give that old lawyer's answer. Well, it depends. We're going to have to take a look at your title. We're going to have to see if there are what are called reservations or exceptions by some prior owner, and if so, is that still a valid, problem with your land? And of course, that area of who owns what is one of the basic issues that the courts in Ohio have had to wrestle with over the past decade or so.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I kind of a joke that I think is funny within some of us, especially like our junior associate. I tell her, like, it's amazing how often 100-year-old deed is causing us trouble, right? Like the people who wrote that deed never imagined what would be happening today and what that would mean as far as who owns something. So
and I think
it's amazing.
We're planning on doing an episode dealing with mineral rights ownership. Okay, but it is back in about the 1880s. Folks, especially in southeastern Ohio, started saying, I'm going to sell you my property, but I'm going to keep the mineral rights. And me and my heirs will be able to benefit from that, okay? And unfortunately, sometimes people, every time there was a deed, there'd be a reservation, which is very confusing. There's a lot of detective work and jigsaw puzzle putting together when you're trying to put these things together. But under Ohio law, what happens when you make that reservation? And by the way, people back in the 1880s and to the 1920s didn't do that for oil and gas. They did it for coal in southeastern Ohio. Because if a coal company were to come in and lease and mine coal, they wanted to be able to get coal royalties. But mineral rights are mineral rights, and they include not only coal, but they include oil and gas and hydrocarbons, and who knows what science is going to develop is a mile underneath us. But when you do that, you make that reservation, you actually create a layer of ownership, because the normal ownership, as we learned in law school, was from the surface to the center of the earth is what you own under your property. But when you do these reservations and exceptions, you kind of make it like a parfait. There are surface rights, and then there are mineral rights, and then somebody else owns the mineral rights, but they want to drill, and it comes in on your surface. Do they have the right to drill on your surface? Do they have the right to use your water? Do they have the right to lay a blacktop lane back and have a drilling unit the size of a Walmart parking lot on your land? It creates a lot of issues now that there's something very valuable a mile or so down underneath our surface rights.
Right. And I feel like that's something that we talk about a lot too, is that this is really an asset, right? It's something that a lot of people, and especially in southeastern Ohio, have owned for generations, or they've always had it, but now the value is different, and it's, brought all these things to the surface.
Right.
If we're going to use a pun.
Yeah. And as you know, the other issue, and I think we'll address this in more detail in a future episode, is once you've made that reservation, once you've taken the mineral interest out from the ownership from the surface to the center of the earth, that is an interest in real estate that Ohio law says upon your death passes to your heirs, whether it goes through a probate proceeding or not. When they pass away, it goes to their heirs. And as you know, Kate, southeastern Ohio families have followed the biblical injunction to go forth and multiply. And so we sometimes run into several generations now, dozens of cousins
Sure.
who have some kind of a small fractional interest in the reservation that might have been made a century ago.
I personally understand that. So being
so
from
you have to-
southeastern Ohio.
There you go.
Yeah.
And so you have to be a genealogist also in order to try to figure these things out. So that's one of the reasons why it's so complicated. I find it interesting because, once again, you're solving a puzzle. You're trying to find out what's really going on here.
Yeah, me too. So, well, great. Is there anything else that you would like to say about yourself for our first episode of the Oil and Gas Law Podcast?
Well, for oil and gas trial lawyers, okay, and they're oil and gas transactional lawyers. As a matter of fact, we do a lot of transactional work. We review leases and deeds, and we set up trusts and limited liability companies for ownership of mineral rights of our clients. But for the landowner advocate trial lawyer in oil and gas, you have to have this concept that you are David versus Goliath, because the oil and gas companies have billions of dollars now that they're basically consolidating. They're big, publicly traded. They have very excellent lawyers who do nothing but oil and gas. And as you and I know, our normal day in a courtroom is us sitting with our Mr. and Mrs. Farmer, our clients, and a row of 16 cowboy boots from Oklahoma City or Houston. And so you have to have this ability as a landowner advocate to say, I'm going to be up to that challenge. I'm going to be understanding that the other side has more resources than I do. They can outspend my client. But in reality, the only way that a landowner can seek justice in Ohio at this time in oil and gas is to rely upon the courts. And especially, we love to talk to juries, because juries understand where our clients are coming from, not so much a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
Sure. Well, thanks, Tom.
Okay. Well, folks, please join us for future episodes in which we explore challenges landowners face in Ohio oil and gas law. Thanks.